What's up, guys? This is Xander Bennett from Rare Candy here. Today, doing the Toronto, Ontario Standard Regional Meta discussion. I'm here with these three excellent players, all of which who have had phenomenal results within this past year. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to go ahead and get started with talking about the different decks of the standard format. So, Danny, go ahead and introduce yourself first.
What's up? My name is Daniel Altavilla. I've been playing the game since 2004. Um, I played for DDG for half of this year and all of last year. Was on Team DDG. Now I am unsponsored, so if anyone's looking, hit up your boy. I have some decent accomplishments throughout my years playing, and mostly I'm focusing on creating content through writing articles for sites like Team Rocket's Hideout. And um, besides that, I just strive to do the best I can at events and just kind of have fun with the game. So,
Isaiah?
Hi guys, my name is Isaiah Bradner. I am a first year master this year. This year I have gotten top 4 at Atlantic City Regionals and top 8 at the Knoxville Regionals, and then I won NAIC last year in senior, so those are kind of my big accomplishments. Much like Danny, I don't have a team or anything right now. I also enjoy writing articles for Team Rocket's Hideout and then coaching. I just love playing the game and helping people however I can. So, um, pretty much like that, just enjoy having fun playing the game, and glad to be here. Thanks, Ender.
Glad to have you. And then lastly, Zach?
Hi, Zak Krekeler, not to be confused. I've also been playing the game for quite a while. Got my first tournament when I was back in 2000 when I was 6, so been quite a bit. Recently, biggest accomplishment recently was top 16 at the World Championships with Dark Box. I've also been very involved with the business side of Pokemon. If you've bought from Yeti Gaming at any of these events, you've probably uh, also like them, trying to do well. Also writing articles for PokeBeach, not for Team Rocket's Hideout. But yeah.
Yeah, these guys are humble. They have all made top 8 of at least one international championship, if not more, in the standard format. So these guys are going to have some great advice to give to you as you prepare for the regionals in Toronto. So we've had a few different big tournaments to talk about since Sword and Shield has been legal. There was the international in Melbourne, the SPE in Puerto Rico, and then the recent regional in Malmo. We're not going to go through every single tournament, but it's mainly just like we have a good set of data to examine going into this regional. And right now, the big target that everyone has on their back is the ADP Zacian deck that uses Arceus, Dialga, and Palkia, as well as Zacian to put a bunch of energy into play, do a bunch of damage. Recently, there has kind of been some different variations where at Malmo, a bunch of people were playing Energy Spinner in their deck, which is a item card that you can search your deck for an energy, but if you went second on your first turn, you can get 3 basic energies instead. So people are playing that over Tag Call and Guzma Hala as their way to get special energies. So we're going to go ahead and move to Danny, and then I want to hear, just at first, like, what are your thoughts on the ADP Zacian deck right now as a whole? Is it the end all be all of standard format that people are making it out to be, or do you think that it's pretty fine?
well, it feels honestly a lot like Buzz um, where it's the kind of deck that is just so oppressive through aggression that will really attack hard to beat it. And ADP is literally allowing you to take an extra prize card with every KO. So that's something, except for lower deck that rely on Keldeo really fast, really straightforward. The lists, there's two main lists. The tag engine, 40 or less, meaning that there's so much space after you put your engine together that you can tech for pretty much any matchup you want to beat. So it's the kind of deck where you're really beating what you really want to beat. and then against anything else, even if they're prepared for you, they still have a bit of a mountain to climb to actually win. So like that kind of feels like how oppressive Buzzrock was, but even more so because you also have the built-in like Intrepid Sword. You have Metal Saucer for guaranteed energy excel over Max Elixir, which was a big maybe, and then you have Altered Creation, which is just like uh, power like that is something the game has not seen. So definitely, it is the strongest deck, I'd say. But it's so linear, and linear decks do end up having weaknesses that are very exploitable. So that is what people, I think, are going to start exploring now that lists have kind of settled. So we'll see how it goes from here.
Isaiah or Zach, you guys have anything you want to add to that?
I want to say that I think in Toronto it's going to probably be a bit less countered. Like Daniel said, they're going to find out ways to counter it from here. I think that it's going to be a bit harder because the lists that this weekend in Malmo were a bit weird compared to at least the ones that we'd had before. They all played the Rangaroo that could obviously put 3 cards back with resource management. As you said, they played the Energy Spinner version. There was a lot of difference between, or not a lot of difference, but there was a decent amount of difference between the ADP Zacian list. So I don't expect as many people to have enough time to counter ADP Zacian for this weekend. So I don't think that it'll be super countered this weekend. Also, in the vein that it didn't do insanely well in Oceania, it did well, but obviously Mewtwo Welder won, and I don't think there wasn't actually an ADP Zacian in top 4, right? It was just 4 different decks. So I don't think the deck was seen as the oppressive best deck in format by then. So I don't think the preparation for Toronto up to this point has been trying to beat that deck as the #1 priority. So I think that people aren't going to be able to counter it as much as Toronto because it hasn't been the focus point of the radar for that long, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I
Right,
understand.
like ADP, it's definitely been popular everywhere. Like you can look at cup results and just these other things. Like it's been a solid like chunk of the meta, but like the lists were definitely a lot more similar after the OCIC. So if you've been testing it, you've probably been testing against one of those,
Yeah.
and you haven't been able to test against the new ones. Like you might not be familiar with the Energy Spinner or any of the techs that they've been able to include, like the Oranguru. So I can see a lot of people just running into those and hitting a wall hard just because they haven't had time to prepare.
I feel like overall, though, kind of gonna mesh a lot of your thoughts together. I think ADP Zacian's probably the best deck to day 2 the tournament, but I don't know if it's the best deck to win the tournament. Like, I feel like more often than not, if you're a decent player, it'll get you there because its conversion rates seem to be pretty high. But then, like, moving to top 8, I don't think it's always the same way. I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just kind of an observation. Like, looking at these, like, you're right, Isaiah. 3 ADP Zacians made top 8 at OC, but none of them made it past top 8. Then at Puerto Rico, there was 1 in top 4, 1 in top 8, and then at Malmo, it got first, second, and third. So that was the first of these big tournaments that ADP Zacian has won since being in standard. But it's definitely a threat. Do you guys have any? If you're facing ADP Zacian just generally, it's kind of hard. We're not going to go matchup by matchup, but what's your best piece of advice to try to take out the game? Do you focus more on the Zacians, on the ADPs? What's kind of your thought going into that matchup with like a standard aggressive deck?
So I guess I'll start. Basically, a big key for me is if you can not do something to the RCS Dialga Palkia itself before it's able to use Ultimate Ray. Not necessarily Altered Creation. You're probably not going to have time to stop that attack. But if you can stop the second acceleration wave, that tends to slow them down quite a bit. To the point where they can miss an attack in one of the consecutive turns, and you can use that time to manage to get ahead. That's typically how I've been approaching it, and it's been somewhat successful.
Danny, you got anything?
Honestly, I missed the question.
Oh no, you're fine. That's totally fine. I said, what is your main game plan when you're facing ADP Zacian? Like, what do you think the easiest way to beat that deck is?
So that's the thing about the deck is that every deck can have a game plan, but that doesn't always mean anything. So for example, the only deck that I've played in this meta so far has been Malamar, and your game plan as Malamar was to clear vision turn 1 against ADP. If you couldn't clear vision, then you had to go in with Tag Purge, and if they have a gust effect to get around the Tag Purge, then you lose. If they don't, then you still probably lose, but it's doable. So I just chalked the matchup down to a 50-50, maybe slightly unfavored because Malamar gets Mally hands sometimes, and would just roll with that. But looking at other decks and how they interact with ADP, it kind of feels like it's out of your control, because even if you destroy that first ADP, they bring up the ADP, altered creation, you one-shot it with like a triple E power tag bolt, whatever. Even if that happens, they can still go double metal saucer, attach, take 3 prizes twice, and then you lose. So it feels like it's the and this kind of brings me back to my Buzzrock point, where like everyone had a Mew EX, everyone had a Mewtwo evolutions. They were ready for Buzzrock. They had some, even Zoropod had Golisopod on top of all that. They were ready to take these one shots, but sometimes the deck just completely ran you over, and there was just nothing you could do about it. And any deck that gives ADP even a single turn is more than likely going to get run over, especially if you're not playing your own Zacian, because Intrepid Sword is such an advantage. Every turn that they have that they're not being aggressive, they're drawing 3 cards, potentially charging up another attacker, and every turn that you have where you're not being aggressive, you're passing. So I feel like the deck is just so out of control sometimes that and people are really capitalizing on that with the Mawile GX and things like that, where now they're taking a 3 prize KO on something like a Dedenne GX for only 2 energies now. So you don't have to extend as hard as you did to be able to cheese some games against these decks that can one shot your ADP turn 2, and that is truly scary. So I'd say like going back to the Malamar thing, the only way you can beat ADP in my opinion is through building your deck with a hard answer to the actual altered creation being clear vision, or something that's hyper aggressive like a welder box where you can KO the ADP like maybe before they altered creation. But besides that, there's nothing that you can really do to consistently come out on top against them, which is why, in my opinion, it's the BDIF.
Isaiah, anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say I think that one thing that's been pretty big is people have played Fear Vision in a lot of decks to try to counter ADPization, so that kind of be like a base, I guess, to counter it. And like Zach said, killing it before. I think it's actually kind of important to understand ADPization as a deck, because some games you have to take different game plans against it. Like if you can't, if you don't kill it after you use altered creation, then there are sometimes when you just have to kind of ignore the ADP. You just kind of have to go after the Zacian. You have to hope they don't get the double patch in the middle of one turn, because they don't want to be doing 180 per turn. That's still fine for them. They have catchers. They can take 2 prizes on Jirachi and such, but their goal is to be blowing up your big attacker with Zacian. So sometimes you have to go around it and just try to game plan, kill Zacian, kill the Dene. So I think it is important to know whether that should be your best game plan, or your best game plan should be just to kill the ADP. So understanding the matchup is really important, because there are a lot of different ways you have to go about it, just because they have so many tools. So even if just one wrong placed attack can just seal the game for them.
I feel like the ADP Zacian deck is like 2 different decks put together that you have to figure out how to beat both of. Because if it doesn't matter if you can beat the ADP deck if they just double metal saucer attach, like we've said, or it doesn't matter if you can beat the Zacian deck. Like, cool, they draw no metal patches, they're just going to ultimate ray and power up their Zacian anyway. So I think that my best advice for people going to Toronto is figuring out which foot do you want to put them on. Do you want to try to make them go the ADP route? Is there a way that you can make your deck do that, or do you need to force them to go the Zacian route? And I think that's what's scary, is because this deck, like, they can just end the game in 3 attacks or even less than that after they use Altered Creation. And so you just have to have a plan right out of the gate and hope that your start is consistent enough that you can deal with the power that they're going to put onto the table. Because they're probably going to out-consistent you. Like, we haven't talked about Intrepid Sword at all. The effect is still ridiculous, and they're playing to getting to play supporters on top of that. So, deck is very good. Do test against it if you are going to Toronto or any standard League Cup or anything. A lot of this information is good for League Cups too. it might just be a little bit different because it's best of 1 instead of best of 3, but I don't think that changes too much. Or at least the majority of League Cups are best of 1. I'm not going to assume too much. So let's just go ahead and we'll look at a few more decks. We'll start with the Melbourne tournament, and Mewtwo won. And Danny, I'm going to bring this to you because of the Mewtwo Welder deck versus the Mewtwo Malamar deck. Both decks have seen amounts of success. The Mewtwo Malamar deck is definitely the newer one of the two. If you were going, or you are going to Toronto, if you're playing Mewtwo at Toronto, which version do you think you're leaning to, and is there like a pro or con for either?
So, honestly, I think the Mewtwo Mally deck is just so bad. I'm not sure why people like actually brought it to OCIC. There was a lot of it, and it did convert, but I think it converted because the deck has a lot of tricks up its sleeve that that you can steal games and cheese games with those. Horror House being one of the really good ones where uh, you could just steal a game by your opponent passing with a Jirachi active going first, something like that, or there's a lot of tricks that the deck has up its sleeve. Now, as far as consistency, I think it's pretty inconsistent because you're playing a Malamar deck, but you also have these huge attackers, and uh, you you just can't really afford to skip a beat against a lot of these decks because Stamp Nightwatch can help, but it's not going to save you against Intrepid Sword. It's not going to save you against a Pikaram that full blitzes to the bench and now can start playing off the board, things like that. So I think the deck's a bit more inconsistent, which is where the Welder version of Mewtwo kind of picks up on that. It is taking advantage of a finite energy acceleration in the form of Welder over a searchable and infinite energy acceleration in the form of Mally, but and the trade-off is that you also get a fire attacker in that, but the Mally version has options like maybe Ultra Necrozma's um, I forget what the GX attack is called, but the spread 6 everywhere GX attack, Sky Scorching Light GX, and and um, I think if I had to pick between one of the Mewtwo decks, I'd probably go with the Welder variant just because, like I said, it's a bit more consistent. You get a fire type attacker, which is pretty good in ADP Zacian meta. You have the option to Stinger, so you can always outplay your opponent if they ever fill up their board in a way that allows you to abuse the way their board is looking with Stinger. Then that puts on a lot of pressure, and then if they don't do that, they're constantly having to leave a spot open on their board, which a lot of decks can't afford to do right now. So the deck really has a lot going for it, and I would definitely pick that over Mewtwo Mally. And on top of that, Mewtwo Mally just feels like it was
Did you guys lose him? I lost him.
Danny said, where it was kind of inconsistent, right? There are games where you need to set up your Malamar, and then once you set up your Malamar, you have to get the energy in the discard pile. And the biggest thing with the deck was actually hitting Switch was pretty hard, and bench space is very hard with that deck. So I think that those two things are problems with the deck that stop it from being amazing. But I think the deck is fine. It has Stinger, which is a really, really good tool. Obviously, you can use it against a lot of decks. Stinger, Baby Blown can checkmate some scenarios. You have Ultra to take continuous one shots. You have the Trevenor. Like Danny said, the deck has so many options that I think it's actually an okay call into the meta. The hardest thing is going to be drawing your drawing okay, but if you feel like you just want to have a high roll deck, then I feel like Mewtwo Welders or Mewtwo Malamar is a pretty good high roll deck. It also has clear vision, like we were saying earlier, that can stop the ADP. So I think it's a decent high roll deck for the tournament. On the Mewtwo Welder, I actually haven't played very much Mewtwo Welder this format. I assume it's pretty much the same as last format, where it's just a big, powerful deck that you have all the combos that can blow stuff up. So I'm sure that Mewtwo Welder is a good deck. It's probably top tier, but if I'd go to Toronto, then I'd have to put in games with Mewtwo Welder. If it were today, then I'd probably play Mewtwo Malamar because I agree with it. But if I put in games, I'm still playing that deck. It's been one of my favorites throughout this entire year.
I think the main thing that I see the Mewtwo Welder deck succeeding more than the Mewtwo Malamar deck is that it doesn't really matter the fact that Malamar is an infinite resource as opposed to your 4 copies of Welder plus a given number of Pal Pads. It doesn't matter when you're only going to be attacking a few times in the game. Like, you're going to get your powerful plays and then it's going to be done. And so, like, if you play Malamar and you have 4 energies in your discard pile at the end of the game, it's like, okay, cool. Like, it doesn't even matter that I do have more of this option available because the game's over. And so the thing that the contrary to that is that Malamar lets you play like real supporters instead of Welder. But I think that really at this point only really means Professor's Research. Like, there's not a lot of other supporters that I think that the Mewtwo Welder deck is sad that they don't get to play or don't get to play to as much effectiveness. And I don't even know if it needs it. There were multiple 4 Welder variants of the Mewtwo deck that succeeded, and I think that'll be continually fine in the future. Zach, you got anything? And then we'll move on to the next deck.
One thing really quick before Zach says, the one advantage that I think that Mewtwo Malamar has, that I've noticed in testing at least, is that Mewtwo Malamar can actually go 3-2-3 on attackers. You can use your Mewtwo, and then it can die, and you can go into Ultra, like the basic Ultra, and attack with that. And then they only go to 5 prizes. So you can actually get an extra attacker in the exchange where Mewtwo Welder has to go double Mewtwo. So if they can one-shot both of those, then you're in a rough spot.
Yeah, their next best option is like Victini V, which is not overall a great attacker. Like, it's fine, but it's not like great.
Yeah, I mean, they can, but I do think as far as Toronto goes, Mewtwo Welder is probably going to be more popular just because instead of like having lesser results, it did really well at the IC. Like, it won. So I have a feeling that alone. Plus, it's also just very similar to the previous iterations of Mewtwo Welder. Like, I feel more people are just going to be familiar with it. As far as which is better, I think they're kind of even. Like, both have a lot of the same tricks against a lot of decks. Both can deal with a lot of different things. I might want to give a slight advantage to Mewtwo Welder just because it is a little bit more aggressive. So it can kind of deal with Zacian just a little bit better, but it's pretty close.
Okay. So the next deck, we're going to shift gears completely. The next deck that I want to talk about is Obstagoon. I know that there have been a little bit of conflicting opinions about that deck from before we started recording. But the deck, admittedly, has had some success, making top 4 at the International and then winning the SPE in Puerto Rico. Caused a buyout on Evital GX, which everyone really appreciates. But is there anyone that feels confident enough in their Obstagoon testing or experience with Obstagoon to comment on whether or not they think this deck is a solid play for this upcoming tournament?
Okay, I haven't tested, but I think the deck is bad personally, even though I haven't done a lot of testing. I just don't think it's a very good deck. I know that that's hard to say when it's had accomplishments, so I'm not going to say it's like a bad deck. Obviously, it has the ways, the tools to get the accomplishments, but I don't think that the deck is as strong as it's probably made out to be. And I also don't think that the good matchups were that good. But for instance, the ADP Zacian matchup, I don't think that matchup is very favorable for you. I think that ADP has a ton of tools. They have the catchers, they have the Fion, and if ADP plays it right, they can use Tingly Return, which is really effective against you, paralyzing your Obstagoon. Ian actually won game 1 against Tim in top 8, and then dead drew the next 2 games, I think. So I don't think that matchup is actually as good as people think. I don't think that matchup is good as people think it is. I think that people don't test it and play against perfectly playing ADP players. So kind of like how Danny was talking about, you can counter it, but the deck has so many options. I don't think that matchup's amazing. In general, I think the deck is pretty easy to counter. It does have ways to quickly end the game with a Veltal GX, which is pretty cool. But I think, like even people playing the Ditto and Mewtwo Malamar, if you get that out on turn 1, 170 snipe on turn 2, Obstagoon has a hard time dealing with that. So I think the deck, it had its time to shine. It had its good finishes. I'm sure it'll still have more good finishes. Just it'll capitalize on going into a good meta. But I would personally not bring it this weekend to Toronto, especially with Sander getting top 4 with this control deck, which I don't think you can beat Miller control either. So I just think the deck has too many weak matchups to balance out the good matchups that it boasts.
Yeah, and I think even on top of that Obstagoon, in order to be willing to play a stage 2 deck in this metagame that's very basic centralized, you have to guarantee that your endgame is going to be powerful enough that it's worth the investment of not setting up possibly like one of every 3 of your games. And I don't think that that upside's really there because, like you said, there's the decks are already playing cards that are going to be naturally good against Obstagoon. Like, decks are not playing Fion because of Obstagoon. They're playing Fion because it's a really good card. The same goes for catchers. The same goes for, like, Ability Zards playing Ninetales. Like, decks are playing these cards that just happen to be good against you. And especially with ADP Zacian being such a threat, I don't think that matchup's guaranteed good at all. Like you said, like you can find your way around taking 3 knockouts after you use Altered Creation, and that's no big deal whatsoever. And then other decks, I think, have some answers too. Like, it might not be the best answer, but since Obstagoon takes 2 attachments or they have to find the counter gain off a Rosa, you're going to force them into a position that they're not going to be able to set up. And I also think the deck is very stampable. If you're able to go stamp knockout, the deck does not play options to really get around that. And so I think just like all those things combined, I would rather play a deck that can do stuff on turn 1 of the game. Like we were talking about Zacian as a like 1-trick pony or even like maybe a 2-trick pony between the ADP deck and the Zacian deck. Obstagoon is very linear. You're just hoping to go for you want to use Obstruct, and if you're able to do the other stuff with some of the little one-of techs you play, then that's good. But I've always kind of doubted Obstagoon. As cool as it is, and as sad as it was to see Danny not top 8 the International because he faced Obstagoon, I know I was so sad, but my Twitter meme was good, and so I can't necessarily be too disappointed about that. It was still, it's still just like I don't know if I see the deck as one that's going to succeed too much in the long future. And even past the set, if we get a good VMAX that sees play in standard, that's gonna thrash it because it's an evolution, so it's gonna do literally nothing. So
Also, Stefan played Carton Boy, Ultra Force Carton Boy in his deck this weekend to
Yes.
counter Goons. So like people are respecting it as well, which makes the deck even worse against even his best matchups.
yeah, one card counter to turn the matchup from very bad to very good.
Yeah, so Obstacle, it reminds me a lot of like decks like Greninja almost. So it's like if people aren't respecting them at all, then they're going to do great. So like Greninja, if people wanted to play Giratina in it, then it would stop it. And you're running into a field of Giratina, Greninja is terrible. The difference though is that it's not like you have to play a one of tech to beat Goons that isn't good against anything else. You just play what you're playing normally, and you're probably pretty good against it. Like even beyond like the Fion, like the fact that ADP's a lot of them writing Mawile GX, like that just crushes it. Like, so I have a feeling for the future, if people stop respecting it as a deck, then it'll definitely have a chance to come back, kind of cyclically like decks like Greninja. But right now, I wouldn't want to touch it.
Yeah, I think we kind of nailed it. I don't even think you need to say anything, Danny, about it. I think we beat that horse a little bit. So sorry, Goons, you're not getting the thumbs up from us. But if this is not a saying that you're dumb if you play it. If you want to play Obstagoon, you think it's a good deck, that's great. This is just our suggestions. You can take this with as many grains of salt as you wish. So next, I'm just gonna lump them all together. Let's just talk about control in standard for a little bit. There's been the Cinccino Mill deck, which has just been a very straightforward, like, I'm just going to get you to 0 cards in deck as fast as possible, playing very little on-board disruption because they're just hoping to end the game by decking you out. Then recently, Sander top forward Malmo with this very unique kind of Oranguru Zacian combo deck that's playing kind of the similar cards that the Mill deck is, but it brought back some of the Pidgeotto elements like the Articuno, even played Team Yellgrunt, which is really interesting. So I'm just going to kind of lump all of this together. What's your guys' current stance on control and standard? We saw it dominate expanded overall with a large portion of the decks in day 2 being some variety of like stall or like you don't get to have a hand, thank you Trevnor, and a bunch of different stuff. What are your guys' current thoughts on standard? Because the card pool is definitely smaller than what we see in expanded.
You guys mind if I hit this one?
You got it, Danny. You got it.
All right. So my thing about the Sander placement is I feel like Sander is always pretty well positioned in Europe because nobody plays degenerate decks over there, or like rarely they do. If anything, it's only Sander at a lot of these events playing those degenerate decks. And then Jesper last year played Pidgey to much success as well. Um, and the reason that these players, especially Sander, are able, in my opinion, to consistently do well at these events with these decks is because because they don't play it, no one's respecting them. So these players who do play these decks are generally pretty well poised going into any given event. Sander is also very intelligent as a player, clearly, to even come up with these ideas in the first place. So he knows what he's doing. He knows how to navigate these matchups. I'm sure he's outplaying people. But on top of that, their lists are just not ready for control. And he's only done poorly against the decks that he's supposed to lose to. So, for example, hitting multiple Pikarom at the last event where he played Guru Greens, and Pikarom was a loss for him at that event. He ended up losing to it, didn't do great. Any other event that he's played in, even with greedy lists like Pidgey with one Chip Ice Axe, he's still done well. Because people are just not ready for these kind of decks. I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience against these kind of decks, and that shows in Sanders' placements. Not to take anything away from him, I think it's still, it takes a lot to be able to consistently top with these decks, but I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that no one plays them over there. Whenever I see Sander topping these events, at first I'm like, oh man, his deck has to be crazy, and then I kind of come back down to earth, and I think maybe maybe he was just well poised going into the event, but the deck might not actually work that well. And when you look at the list and his write up and stuff, he sounds not very confident in the ADP Zacian matchup, and it kind of shows because he lost to one that didn't really have much going for it to kind of go against his deck. I think Intrepid Sword kind of hurts that control deck, and I'm not confident that it beats ADP Zacian. It probably beats it a little bit better than Mill does because of the fact that you have the Articuno Chip package to potentially cheese a win, but Intrepid is going to hurt you. And I think ADP right now is beating Mill more capably than it ever has been. Now that people are playing the 8 catchers or the Oranguru like Torrid had, Mill is just honestly, I think how that even goes is that Mill just decks out. You have a Guru, they either deck out or they put down 2 more prizes for you. So I think that the Sander deck is better than Mill right now, but that both decks kind of feel not great, and that Sander was just naturally poised to do well at the event, as he always is, with how the meta is always shaped up in Europe to favor aggression more so than degenerate kind of strategy.
Isaiah, you've also played Pidgeotto to some success before Sword and Shield. Do you agree? Do you disagree?
Pidgeotto is actually probably one of my favorite archetypes I've ever played in the game. I just loved playing the deck. I thought it was a super cool deck. So I love control in general. I always try to make those work. I'm not sure about my thoughts on control this format. I really want it to work. I've been playing a good bit of it, trying to get it to work in some way. I think that I'm almost positive that there's some control list out there that's completely broken and beats this format. I just think there's no way that's not true. I think that's true for almost every format, but especially I think this format is true here. But I think that, like Danny was saying, I think the mill deck it's kind of been exploited, right? It was kind of the same thing with Obstagoon, but it was a really cool deck. It went into everyone knew about it going into Oceania. It was kind of like under the radar at first, but then it got a lot of traction because it won so many stuff in Japan, and then it won like 2 winner boxes that one weekend in the US, and then it kind of blew up, right? So, and I think it was like 58 cards of the list that won that one winner box made it to top 4. So it wasn't like the deck had very many innovations. It was like the exact same deck taken from the list that were in America and brought to the Oceania. So I think the deck has kind of been solved. People found out how to beat it going into this tournament. They were ready for it. And kind of like Danny said with Sander, where he comes in with a deck that is ready to beat. So I think that what Sander, he came in with a deck that he felt was favored against ADP Zacian. But like we talked about how the list changed, I think the list might have changed. Tord played Oranguru, a bunch of them played Oranguru. I actually don't know if Medi played Oranguru in his list. If anybody knows that. But I think that he probably didn't expect that going in. So that was a bit unfortunate for him. Obviously, his deck was a bit focused around situational denial, right? He had the Persian, the Poniard, the no Belelba, so he was a very laid back controller. He tried to build up with Zacian. Even when you read his post where he talks about all the different ways he denies, I think he had a very specific game plan against ADP Zacian, and when they could play the Aranger, that could just throw it off. So I think that the deck is really good. I think that Sanders' list is probably the best way to play it right now that we've discovered, but I also agree with Danny that I would not bring this deck to Toronto if one, you have not played a ton of games with it or are very confident with control in general, and two, you are not very confident in the metagame because, like Danny said, you're going to take losses to decks.
Right. So, like, I think that's definitely big. Like, if you're going to look at Sanders' deck, I and pick it up, you've only got 2 or 3 days to learn it. So, unless you already know control really well, it's probably not going to go well for you if you just pick it up and do it. On Cinccino Mill, that's actually a deck I've been playing a lot recently. I took it to Para-League Cups this weekend and won both of them with it. Just because.
Nice.
So if the thing is, if it's like Goons, if you're not respecting it, you're going to lose to it. And a lot of the lists that came out of the OCIC, the Zacian ADP list, any of the Baby Blind stuff, Goons, for example, they're not prepared for it. So any player playing that, you just run into Cinccino, you lose to it. So it's the sort of thing where if you want to beat it, it's not terribly tough. The lists from Malmo do that. Like if you want to play the Oranguru or the 8 Ketra version. But if people stick with the OCIC list themselves, then Cinccino's probably going to do well. As for whether or not to play it for Toronto, it kind of all depends on that. If people want to quickly adapt to what Tord and them have been doing with the Oranguru or throw more catches into where they're dealing with Cinccino, then it's going to be tough. But if they stick with lists that they've tested, which have been like from the OCIC or a little bit after that, just with minor techs, then if the majority of players do that, Cinccino is going to be a solid play.
I think that my biggest issue with the current mill deck right now is they're not respecting onboard presence, which I think in a way is correct, because since so many decks are just throwing so many energies on the table, it's really hard to deal with all that stuff. Like the Pidgey deck that was playing Articuno and Misty and Lorelei was like, even at its best, still struggling to keep up with stuff on board. And like, frankly, I don't think Misty and Lorelei is great. That's a discussion for another time. But like, you can't keep up with the aggression that decks are putting on the board. So they are just moving to, okay, I'm going to deck you out as fast as possible. I'm going to send a bunch of Pokédolls up. You're not going to be able to beat them. But then you lose to the onboard presence of decks that can just like, okay, you're not going to disrupt their action. They can power up one attacker and then just draw, attack, draw, attack, draw, attack. And you are the one that has to find your Bellaba and Bryson Mans and your Surges and your Palpads and all that stuff so that you can hopefully deck them out, because they've done everything they need to do. And for the rest of the game, they could just have a Giratina and they could use Shadow Impact, or they can have a Mewtwo and they can use whatever, or a Pikarom and just use Tag Bolt. And they're going to win the game eventually for as long as you miss a card or two. Like, the deck is very combo-centric. And it's not combo-centric in the way that Pidgey had, like, one huge turn that they would go Plant, Stamp, Surge, Mars, Jesse and James, Chip Ice Axe, and then, like, do whatever. Because at that point, they had control of the game. This deck is combo-y every single turn of the game. You have to hope for the best, that you can draw the Palpads in the right order, all that stuff. And whereas Cinccino is more efficient than Pidgey, like, I think if you did build a Pidgey-style deck, you'd build it with Cinccino now. I think that since you're not respecting just their ability to knock you out in the Cinccino deck, that the burden of proof is on you to win the game. It's not on them to, like, lose the game. All right, we're coming towards the end. There are a few different decks that if you guys have some individual thoughts on, maybe I'll just do one person for each deck. Zach, I'm going to give you the choice to talk about either Baby Blacephalon, Pikarom, or how about you pick between those two? I'll give Danny normal Malamar. So you talk about Baby Blacephalon or Pikarom. We'll give Isaiah the other one, and then we'll give Danny the last one, and then do some shout-outs.
Gotcha. So I haven't tested Pika Rom a ton, so I guess I'll go with Baby Blooms because I have tested that a bit. It's solid. I mean, it's very consistent. It does what it needs to do, like to survive in a Zacian heavy format. Like it's consistent enough with its quick attack that you can deal with the ADP. I think the addition of Lucky Egg was huge for that deck, and I'm also really liking the Beastbringer tech that's being played in a lot of them. So it's definitely something I would try and be prepared for Toronto. I think it's straightforward enough that there's going to have people playing it. Like it's a nice, quick, easy. I don't know what to play deck. Let's go with Baby Browns. I have a feeling it will do well. I wouldn't expect it to win just because it's so linear. But like Zacian, it does what it does pretty well.
All right, Isaiah, you want to chat about Pikarom?
Yeah, I've played a lot of Pikarom, so I have some kind of strong feelings on this concept. I think Pikarom's a very good deck, but I think that if you play Pikarom, you have to play it with Pokemon Catcher, not Custom Catcher, and that you should be playing Cynthia and not Volkner. I think that Volkner Custom Catcher is way too slow in this format, and if you play that, then you're going to get outsped by ADP Zacian 100% of the time. I think you need to take a turn 1 kill with Pikarom on a Jirachi against ADP Zacian, and then find a way to kill an ADP and find a way to kill a Zacian throughout the rest of the game, whether it's through tag bolts or through Raichu into just killing the Dedenne. So I think you have to play Pokemon Catcher and you have to play Cynthia in the deck. Build your Pikarom list like that. If you do that, then I think the deck is actually pretty good in this format. Tag bolt, unless people play Mew. People tech Mew, the deck is horrible because your game plan is tag bolt against pretty much every deck. But if they don't, which people aren't right now, I think Pika could be a pretty good play for this weekend. It's consistent. It's always been consistent, and the deck is under the radar, and it's just as good as it used to be.
I've seen a lot of stuff online about why decks are playing Pokemon Catcher instead of Custom Catcher, and the idea is really short. If you have one Custom Catcher in your hand versus one Pokemon Catcher in your hand, you have a 50% chance of bringing up what you want with the Pokemon Catcher. You have a 0% chance of bringing up what you want with the Custom Catcher. If you have two Custom Catchers in your hand and two Pokemon Catchers in your hand, you have a 100% chance of bringing up what you want with the Custom Catchers. You have a 75% chance of bringing up what you want with the Catchers. So what you have, your gain on having one is 50%. Your loss on having two is 25%. And so that's definitely where Pokemon Catchers are kind of coming back again. But the 8 catcher list was really cool. I do have to point that out. And it was 8 catchers and crushing hammers, right? That was gross. I saw that too. Someone played like 4 custom catcher, 4 Pokemon catcher, and 4 crushing hammer. Okay, Danny, hit us up with some Malamar thoughts, and then we will do some shout outs and go to sleep.
I think the OCIC list for Malamar was a really good start for the deck. There was one fatal flaw, though, actually two. The first being that the deck lacked Espeon Deoxys, so matchups that were normally really good, like Ability Zard or Mewtwo Mally, got a little bit more tough because you didn't have a really strong spreader late game. So if you passed for a turn or even 2 turns, in the past you would be able to make up for that with the Espeoxys. Now you couldn't. So, and then on top of that was the Solgaleo Lunala. It was very poorly thought out as a tech option. We were thinking Zacian has 230 HP or 220 HP. This guy hits 230. Let's roll. Yeah. And the thing was that it just didn't have any other options available to it. It was just very linear as an attacker. Now I just got top 4 at a cup with Mally this past weekend. I love Mally, by the way. I just got top 4 at a cup this past weekend with Mally, running Genku in the Solgaleo slot and Espeoxys in the 4th spell tag slot. If you think about it, in the matchups you need 4 spell tags. In Espeoxys, spreading 10 is going to be better than the 1-4 spread, even though you are less likely to hit a spell tag when you play 3 instead of 4. But that rarely matters. And then the Genku is actually very overpowered in this meta, or in this format. So the 2 big things that come out of the Genku, the first is that you get to play differently completely, because games where you slip up for a couple turns but spell tag damage will allow you to force a tie or to force a sudden death situation, the Horror House play in sudden death is OP. So that's something that there are games where you'll scoop early at a certain point where you're not going to win or you'll bring it to sudden death, but you have no sudden death options being a Malamar deck. Now you get to finish those games. The second thing is if your opponent passes going first, which every deck pretty much wants to go first, if your opponent passes with one Pokemon in the active and you get the turn one Horror House, then you're more than likely donking them. Towards list for ADP, I believe just played, I want to say like 36 plus trainers. So
37.
37, yeah, 37 exactly trainers. So the odds are you're probably donking them if that happens. Another thing is that it's only 2 energies instead of 4 energies, so you can blind Poltergeist. And in this meta where people are using Intrepid Sword, people are Stellar Wishing, then Weldering, then sitting on their hand for next turn, holding Stamps and Gust, where people are, just like even a deck like Mill, where you can cheese them by like spreading damage onto the bench, and then they use Belelba, the second effect, to discard 3 from hand and from their own deck. There's a point where Horror House could even steal you a game in that situation. So it definitely offers a lot more versatility than the Sol de Leo did. That was a huge flaw, where if I had that Genki, I think a couple games would have gone my way that didn't otherwise. And the Espioxys definitely helps against goons, gives you a pretty solid spreading option that is available to you against Mill sometimes, and in general saves you in some games where you might not get the spell tag damage or where you slip up early. So I can see Malamar being really good. It boasts I want to say a 45-55 against ADP Zacian. Sometimes it feels closer to 50-50. It depends how much of the stones you hit. And then every other matchup is really good outside of things like Mill and Obstagoon, which give you some trouble. So I'd say if you don't know what to play for Toronto, and you don't want to have to play ADP mirror all day, that Mally's a good option. It definitely will allow you to have a lot of contentious games, and that is really really good in this meta where something is just really taking a hard L to something.
Okay, so I got one short question for everyone, and then once you answer it, do your shout outs. What is the safe play for Toronto, and what's the risky play for Toronto? Danny, I'm going to send it back to you, and then feel free to shout out anyone that you want to when you are done.
The safe play for Toronto, in my opinion, is going to be the tag call version of ADPization. It is a little less greedy than the Tord version as far as setting up, but has less consistency off of people's stamps and things like that. And it also has the room to play stuff like stamps, so it's definitely a really good, safe, kind of neutral 50-50s all around version of ADP. And I'd say the risky play is Malamar, just because I think you do take some hard L's to things like Obstagoon and Mill. While I think they will be at an all-time low for this event, it's something that if those decks ended up converting well, you would not be able to do well. And also taking a 45-55 against ADP is so risky because the matchup is not only a coin flip, but they could play things like Metal Core Barrier, Malilana. People can be experimenting with different techs, and that can hurt you. So if all goes well, Mally, I think, has better odds to win the event. The ADP is just the safest deck, hands down. And then as far as shout-outs, shout out to, I guess, my family for always supporting me super consistently throughout my entire Pokemon career. And yeah, that's it.
All right, Isaiah, safe. Oh wait, do you have any shout outs, Danny?
No,
I dropped
he
them already.
Oh, I totally missed it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I looked down for 1 second and then I missed something. Isaiah, safe play, risky play,
Yeah.
shout outs. I'm on a roll.
Okay. So the safe play, I'm gonna say I'm just gonna go with ADPization. I think the tag call version, I agree with Danny, is more consistent on turn one, and in the early game. So I think that's probably the safest play that you can have for this tournament. It's a good deck. I mean, you'll probably do well if you know what you're doing with the deck. For the risky play, I think it's probably either some type of control deck or baby Blounds. I think that those are just the control deck. If you have it, it can just hit the right matchups and roll through. And then baby Blounds is just such a high roll deck, kind of like Mewtwo Malamar, where if you hit the stones, then I mean you're probably gonna win, right? And even the last few cards in your deck, that can determine how you do. So I think that that's a big deck. But then one last thing, I'd say try to be prepared for Mill this weekend. there's been a trend this year where people have been more comfortable playing mill install decks just all around. I've noticed that a lot at regionals. I think that because the archetype has become more defined this year than it was in the last few years, it's a pretty new archetype. Only like the first time was Nationals with Wailord. So because the deck is becoming more and more mainstream, there's always a staller control archetype. More and more people are feeling comfortable playing it. So I think that I would definitely be prepared for mill this weekend. And then shout out to all my Pokemon people that I test with. And then shout out to my sponsor, Matt Bradner.
Dadner. Matt, the reason I looked down was because your dad liked the tweet about Hunter Butler joining the table of the channel. I was like, why do I have a notification from Matt Bradner? It's all right.
Oh,
And then Zach, you got anything?
All right, so for the safe play, I mean, again, I think it's ADP Zacian. It's the BDIF for a reason. It's not easy to counter. You're going to have a bunch of 50-50s all day, but I don't think there's an objectively better deck that you could play. As far as the risky deck goes, I would probably go with Cinccino, just because if you hit the right matchups, like it's a deck you could go 9-0 with. And if you hit the wrong matchups, then it's a deck that will lead you to exploring Toronto. So it could swing either way, just depending on what you hit and what other people bring. As far as shoutouts, as always, shout out to the fine folks at Yeti Gaming. Y'all are great. And shout out to everyone coming to Toronto this weekend. It's going to be a fun time there. We're running that, so hopefully a lot of people show up.
I'm going to double shout out Yeti Gaming because if you follow my Twitter and you see any Cube updates, Andrew got me a bunch of stuff I need for Cube. I'm constantly messaging him like, hey, do you have this random card from 10 years ago? Do you have it in reverse? And he's like, yeah, we got it. And then, like all the time. I'll message him and it'll be like 1 a.m. in the morning. And I'm like, he doesn't work all the time, but he might. For my safe play, I'll say something. I'm just gonna play devil's advocate for another deck. I think that Mewtwo is a really safe play. I think it's a safe play because if you've played it before, it's not too different from playing it now. Whereas I definitely think that the AGP Zacian deck is much more different than the ADP deck. So if this is your first Sword and Shield tournament because you didn't travel international for one of these larger events, I think that Mewtwo's a really safe play just because the deck plays very similar and your game plan, if you've played enough games, you're able to think of those like different play patterns on the fly. I still don't think that Mewtwo is the best deck to just like pick up and take to a tournament just because you do have literally your entire deck is built on options with Mew 3. But I still think it's really solid. And then I will also say that Cinccino is the risky play, but I think that a Cinccino deck that's built like Pidgeotto used to be is the actual risky deck because I think that the tools are all still there, and I don't know why people really aren't exploring that. I love control decks as much as the next guy, so that's kind of all I think about. And I think that if Pidgeotto was still winning games when Mew 3 and Ability Zard were putting 3 energy into play a turn, if Pikarom got to attack, you almost lost the game, and Malamar got to constantly put 2 energy and play a turn, and it was still winning, that I don't think that ADP Zacian is so much more far up the chain than that. While Lily's Pokédoll and whatnot are really powerful cards, I just think that you still have the end game, and it doesn't even really matter if they're using Intrepid Sword for as long as you're keeping their energy off board, they still can't really attack. So if I was going to Toronto and I had more time, I would really just put a lot of dedication into a Cinccino control deck that just plays 4 Oranguru and you bring back the Articunos and stuff like that. But I want to thank each of these guys for coming out here. Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Isaiah. Thank you, Zach. Their Twitters are plugged. Zach does not have Twitter. If you see any of these guys at Toronto, let them know that you enjoyed this video. They're all super nice people, very willing to work with me for this, and I'm super excited that they're going to be there and enjoy it. Feel free to let us know in the comments of this video if there was something, if you agree, disagree with something, get the discussion going. And once again, just thank you guys for watching this video. So I'm Xander Bennett, signing out for Rare Candy.